Niet hier? Dat is veel te... Carmen, het is veel te dichtbij. Hier moet je, denk ik. Meneer Knibbe, je moet hier... Ja. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me on Zoom? Yes, okay. Well, it is customary at this university to start the ceremony with a prayer, so I will do that. Right now. Spiritus Sancti Gratiae illumat sensus et corda nostra. I would like to welcome the committee here and all those who are on Zoom watching the ceremony. There's nobody here, which is very odd for us, but I hope, Koen, that you don't mind. You knew that, didn't you? I will introduce the members of the committee when they get the floor later to ask their questions. For now, I'd like to give the floor to the candidate for the degree of Dr. Eunice Smith. Please sit down.
Hope you guys can all see the screen. Thumbs up. Yeah, good. With the permission of the Council of Deans, and in order to obtain the degree of Doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my doctoral thesis entitled The Developmental Pathway to Alcohol Use, from Exposure to Consideration to Action. Can you remember the first time you drank alcohol? Still, about 50% of the 12 to 16-year-olds have consumed alcohol even after decline until 2015. Of those who drink, many engage in binge drinking, which is drinking 5 or more drinks in one occasion. Early alcohol use is associated with negative health consequences and predicts alcohol use later on. Still, a lot is to be gained in terms of prevention. The motivational model of alcohol use explains why people drink. It shows that alcohol use depends on predictors, such as your culture, your personality, family drinking and norms. These factors predict beliefs that using alcohol will result in certain positive and negative effects, which are called alcohol expectancies. These expectancies are associated with the final pathway to drinking, which is drinking motives, or in other words, the reason why you take a drink actually. According to this model, there are 4 broad motive dimensions, which are enhancement, drinking to get drunk and to have fun, social, coping, to forget your worries, and conformity, which is drinking to fit in with your peer group, for example. Research, however, did not focus yet on the influence of parents within the motivational model. From childhood up until adolescence, children learn mostly from their parents. Learning theories point out that children learn by observation in terms of both, first, imitation of alcohol use, and second, developing certain ideas or cognitions about alcohol use, such as expectancies. And these cognitions put youngsters at risk of starting early and drink more later on. It is important to further study this because studies focused on parental alcohol use, but not the exposure to it. Or, in other words, how much children actually see. For example, some parents will drink at the dinner table when children are present, whereas other parents might drink mainly with their colleagues after work or when children are sleeping. Second, at this moment, most prevention efforts focus on older adolescents. As alcohol use may be rooted in childhood, we focused on younger children and adolescents to know where and when prevention should start. So how did we examine this? We have 2 projects, and project A, the first one, focused on norms and alcohol expectancies among young children. Project B focused on young adolescents, their expectancies, motives, and early alcohol use. Throughout this project, we focused on parental alcohol use exposure. So in how much children and adolescents see their parents drinking. We recruited participants through primary schools in 5 provinces in the Netherlands. In Project A, we followed families with children between 4 and 6 by visiting them at home for 3 years. During this visit, we conducted child-friendly tasks and asked parents to fill out a survey. And in Project B, we followed families with an adolescent between 10 and 13 for 3 years. Adolescents and mothers finished online surveys. So, let's go to the results. What did we find? First, we asked parents to rate 18 situations on whether it is common to drink alcohol, such as a birthday party, or uncommon to drink alcohol, such as in a car. After this, we examined what young children think what each of these adults was drinking in the 18 situations. You can see here that we have 4 alcoholic beverages, and children had to indicate for each of the adults what they were drinking. Now, what did we find here? We found that children between 4 and 6 already know in which situations adults drink alcohol or not. They attributed more alcohol to adults in more common situations and less alcohol to adults in less common situations. We also found that this knowledge about norms on alcohol use became more accurate over time. Next to norms, alcohol expectancies predict alcohol use years later. That is why we reviewed the literature, and as a result of this, we examined if children and adolescents got stronger ideas about the effects of alcohol, the expectancies, as a result when they see their parents drinking. What we found here was that for both children between 4 and 8 and adolescents between 10 and 16, the general tendency was that the more they see their parents drink, the more positive expectancies they get about the effects of alcohol. For example, children between 6 and 8 develop more positive and less negative expectancies, and adolescents associate alcohol more with social expectancies, such as alcohol makes a party better, and with coping. Alcohol helps to forget about worries. Notably, however, these findings were most robust among fathers drinking. In one other study, we found that both parents' exposure, so for mothers and fathers, was associated with changes in expectancies in as short as 6 months' time. Generally, we found that exposure was a better predictor, so how much the children see was a better predictor than the total amount of what parents drink. So it was mostly how much children and adolescents see. Exposure was also important in another study for early alcohol use among 10 to 13-year-olds, which was mostly sipping behavior, by the way. We already know that there's a link between what parents drink and what their offspring drinks. In our study, we found that some parents drank when adolescents were present, and the children of these adolescent exposing parents were more at risk of having tried alcohol at as young as 10 to 13 years old, which was also, again, only the case for fathers drinking. In a last study, we selected the adolescents that drank at least 1 full glass throughout the study period and investigated why they drank alcohol. We found that 210 of the 755 youth started drinking at least 1 glass. And they started drinking to get drunk, so the enhancement motive, or to be more sociable. However, we also looked at whether these motives were associated with current alcohol use, and we found that the small group that started for coping motives appeared to be at higher risk for binge drinking around the time of alcohol use initiation and 6 months later. So, what can we conclude from all these studies together? Generally speaking, there are several important conclusions. Young children already have certain ideas around alcohol. They know about norms in adult drinking culture and about the effects of alcohol at 6 to 8 years old already. Exposure to parental alcohol use, second, is associated with more positive ideas around alcohol use and experimental drinking among early adolescents. Youth with specific motives are more at risk for alcohol use and binge drinking. However, we have to take into account that there's always room for improvement. For example, our participants were mostly highly educated, higher compared to the general Dutch population. And second, participants may underreport alcohol use in these questionnaires. Therefore, the conclusions of this research should be interpreted with care, and future research has to point out if these conclusions hold true. However, the results do point to a message that parents should be limiting their alcohol use, especially when children and adolescents are present. Thus, prevention should focus on exposure and consider that children start learning when they are young, because exposure to parental alcohol use may make offspring curious, leading to both consideration and action. Having presented this summary of my doctoral thesis, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you very much for this explanation of your findings and your study. It's quite impressive, these children that you've been seeing. Let's now start with the defense of your dissertation, and I give the floor first to Professor Scholte from this university.
Dear candidate, what a wonderful thesis you have produced, and it's truly an honor to be the first to compliment you with it. Your thesis is a combination of a review study, high-quality empirical papers. The various studies comprise large samples, longitudinal data sets covering childhood as well as adolescence, and how on earth did you manage it? I know you had a high-quality team of supervisors, which I congratulate also with the work, but still you must have worked incredibly hard to end up with this set of papers. But as you know, our task as an opponent is to give you some compliments and then start a polite but fierce discussion in which we challenge you to not agree, never agree with what we say. So this is the fun thing about having a defense, and be aware we may exaggerate now and then just for the sake of discussion, at least I will do. So my first question could be very short depending on your initial answer. Your thesis has an interesting cover depicting an epic situation in which a young girl stretches out her left arm to reach for the chalice, the medieval cow horn holding alcohol. Please tell me, what are the motives of the girl to reach for the chalice? What did you want the picture to reflect? Depending on your answer, I will continue, because if you have the same answer as I think, then I will go to my next question. Otherwise, I will challenge you, because I think the picture is wrong.
Right. All right. So, honored sir, thank you for your compliments and also for this question. In this picture, I would say that this girl is mostly curious for what the brother is doing.
No, it's the brother, it's not the father. It's not the father? You said is it the brother or the father that's holding?
The brother.
Okay.
The brother, and the parents are in the sky.
Okay, the parents are in the sky. Okay, let's assume it was the father. Then, because I have a question, I was wondering, so this is the brother, and you think that the girl is stretching her arm because she's curious, maybe because she was exposed to especially what the father was drinking. That's some of the findings you have. My impression was that the girl was trying to withhold the alcohol drinking, but my assumption was it was the father. So maybe my question is not correct. But still, I do have a question about the exposure of the parents and the gender of the children, because you seem to assume that especially daughters are affected by fathers. When if we look at the general parenting literature, there is some kind of gender-specific parenting idea that fathers are mostly influencing the sons, and the mothers are influencing the daughters. Is this what you found in your studies as well? Because I couldn't find out. I think you had mixed findings, considering what the effects were of the fathers concerning the sons versus daughters, and the mothers concerning the daughters versus the sons.
Right. So, what you're generally asking is, how are the gender-specific findings from my thesis, and are they in accordance with what the literature is saying?
Yeah, that fathers are mostly influencing their sons, and mothers are mostly influencing their girls. But still, you assume that sometimes, or some findings indicated that girls were mostly affected by the fathers, not by the mothers. How could you explain this finding, which contradicts usually parenting literature?
Yes, so thank you for this question. It's I'm very aware that there is a body of literature out there focusing on the specific gender of the father or the parent and the child. However, there are mixed findings regarding this. If you look in different reviews, for example, you see that sometimes there are associations between the fathers and both children. Sometimes there's associations between mothers and both children. And sometimes there's very gender-specific findings with mothers with the girls and the fathers with the sons. But there's also a literature out there that shows that there is no difference in the influence by parents. So, as to our findings, what we found is that fathers are in the two studies on alcohol expectancies and alcohol use are most influential in that sense. Mm-hmm. They have there we found significant associations between the exposure and the outcomes of the offspring. They also have one study that was chapter 5. Chapter 5, yeah. If I'm correct, in which we found that there was a specific association between father and son, and not for girls. So there's one example of what you are proposing. So a gender-specific association, but we haven't found any evidence for the rest. We just found the general tendency was that the fathers had the most influence in these two studies.
Yeah. So,
another study, both parents had some influence.
So maybe the whole idea for the gender-specific parenting holds for different behaviors except alcohol expectancies. Could be the case, right? Can I ask another question? My second question is about the theoretical models that you use throughout your studies. The title of your thesis is Developmental Pathway. But I was amazed that you didn't use one of the most influential theoretical models explaining child and adolescent development, namely Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model. Maybe you've heard of it. And simply put, this model states that the individual development of children and adolescents is the result of the interaction between individual characteristics and the direct environment, especially parents and peers. When I read your studies, however nice and even impressive they are, I was struck by the fact that nowhere in your studies, nor in a general discussion, did you consider the following two aspects: individual differences and the influence of cultural norms related to alcohol. And my question is, if the development is the result of the interaction between the environment and individual characteristics, we should look for much more individual differences in the trajectories or the developmental pathways that you examined. And one of your predecessing PhD colleagues already in 2010, maybe you read a paper by Carmen van der Zwaluw, she showed already that the influence of parents is moderated by genetic makeup of the children. Can you come up with some characteristics that you may think will moderate the effects? Because now you just look at age or gender. Or do you think that the patterns that you describe are more or less universal, so there are no individual differences?
So the question is whether I can give some indications of interacting factors of the individual characteristics and the environment.
Yeah.
And I would like to discuss this further. So, among the individual characteristics which are prominent in psychological research and developmental research as well, for example, is personality, our personality characteristics. They have also a very long history within the motivational research among adolescent alcohol use. So one of these, one interesting study I would suppose would be to look further into personality characteristics, because you can imagine that some personality characteristics, for example, extraversion would be one characteristic which would be interesting to see whether the exposure from parents has a bigger influence, for example, and that would be like one moderator which would be interesting to further investigate. Or for example, risk profiles. the substance use risk profile scale, for example. There we find several characteristics from the individual which would make these individuals have more risk for alcohol use. So it would be also interesting to see whether these observational effects, what we find now, would be moderated by these risk profile scales as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, definitely. Well, thank you for all the answers. I just got a signal from the chair that I have to stop. Thank you for the answers. I'm satisfied.
Thank you. Now I'd like to welcome Professor Van der Meen from Tilburg University all the way here. Thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear candidates, first of all, of course, I'd like to congratulate you and your amazing team with your thesis. I read it with much pleasure. Your thesis has a balanced structure and is clearly written. Your study provides new insights into the existing state of scientific knowledge in the field of alcohol research. It describes a socially relevant subject in which scientific knowledge can contribute to a reduction of alcohol consumption in adolescents, which ultimately leads to a better public health. You have shown in your thesis that you processed, analyzed, and interpreted the data with full knowledge of the facts. So you did a great job, and I'm impressed. But as my neighbor said also, my task is not to give solely compliments, but to ask critical questions. So I have some questions, and I start with the first one, and after your answer, go on with the second one. My first question is related to Chapter 7, and is about the relation of Chapter 7 to the central goal of your dissertation. Your central goal is described as to gain insight into the developmental pathway from parental alcohol exposure to alcohol-related cognitions and early alcohol use behaviors among children and adolescents. Chapter 7, however, does not address parental alcohol exposure, and that's the central theme of your thesis. So, although the results of Chapter 7 are very interesting, it seems for me like a kind of standalone chapter, because it's not related to the central theme of your thesis, parental alcohol exposure. So, can you explain what the contribution of Chapter 7 is to the central question?
Honored Madam, thank you very much for your compliments and for your question as well. So, your question covers the central goal of this thesis, which is the developmental pathway, but actually we do not really address this in Chapter 7, which are focusing mostly on drinking motives, but not on the alcohol use exposure. So the reason to include this in the thesis was because the developmental pathway is based on the motivational model. The motivational model is structured from predictors to alcohol expectancies to drinking motives and early use. At some point, we decided that we needed to make the pathway, as if you will, complete by including a chapter on drinking motives. However, for reasons within the sample size, for example, we could not include too many variables in this respect, and we also so drinking motives in a theoretical sense, in my opinion, would not be strongly associated with parental alcohol use exposure because it's the final pathway. So in that sense, you would expect mediation before drinking motives. So, for example, from exposure to expectancies to drinking motives, which would be interesting. But in this sense, we figured we had a too small sample size to actually test all these pathways.
Yes, I understand this analytic reason, but I missed in your discussion chapter a discussion about what the place of this, how this parental exposure and the drinking motives are connected or related. And am I right that I hear you say, well, there is not such a great connection between parental exposure and drinking motives? Or didn't you say that?
I would think that there will be an indirect association with regard to parental exposure to expectancies, which are theoretical predictors of drinking motives and drinking motives themselves.
And what is that indirect association? What is the relation between parental exposure and drinking motives?
Yeah. So what I would think here is that drinking motives is actually the reason at a certain moment why you drink, right? So it's really the motive to actually take a sip of alcohol. But they are theoretically linked to these alcohol expectancies, which are the precursors of these drinking motives. So these expectancies would be more strongly linked to alcohol use exposure in my view, because they are more general ideas about alcohol and not the specific reasons why somebody drinks at a given moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, but it's not a full answer. But I think, well, we can study that perhaps in the next study, the relationship, if we have a greater sample size to put it all in the same analysis. I will proceed with my second question, and that's about prevention. Your conclusion is that reducing exposure to alcohol use by parents is a promising direction to further reduce alcohol use among young people. And that seems clear and straightforward. But my question is, in what way can we reduce exposure of alcohol use by parents? In your discussion chapter, you focus primarily on the parents themselves. Parents should do this and parents should do that. And you propose a national campaign to reduce exposure. But that brings me to several questions. First, why a national campaign? We know from the literature that national campaigns are not that very effective. So are there other possible preventive interventions? And secondly, why focus only on the parents themselves to change their behavior? Isn't it also a task for the government to take measurements instead of education of parents? So perhaps you can elaborate a bit on this.
Thank you for this question again. In this, yeah, please give me a second to write a little bit out here.
But your answer needs to be brief, Koen.
All right, I'll make it.
So then you can choose some questions you like.
Yes. So, what I initially thought was that a campaign such as Niks 18, for example, would easily integrate a message such as this, because now it's mostly focused on the norms. If it now would include a message on parental drinking and its exposure, it would be what would you say, a quick win in that sense. So make more awareness, because awareness is one of the prevention strategies that does have an effect. But I do agree that we should also focus on the more risk groups. Risk groups such as the children of alcoholic parents, for example, or with psychiatric disorders. So I would say that there would also be a form of prevention in the sense of more selective prevention for children who have parents with psychiatric problems and are, for example, guided or supervised by community teams. So I would suggest that there's also one option for prevention is to instruct parents to make sure that to decrease their alcohol use and their exposure in that sense. And your suggestion the second suggestion, which was that? Which one?
Well, very shortly, because my time is up,
Yeah.
the suggestion that the government could also take measurements, for example, to forbid children to go into a pub. In England, that's forbidden. Accompany their parents when they're drinking alcohol. In the Netherlands, it's allowed. Shouldn't that be a good idea? So you can answer yes or no, and then we can
I
go
would
to
say
the next
yes.
opponent.
Yeah, that's one option as well.
Okay,
For example, also promote extra healthy behaviors in sport canteens, for example. That would be another idea.
Okay,
I will
thank you.
give you that.
Thank you for your questions and answer. And now we get a Zoom-to-Zoom defense by Professor Gemil from Lausanne University. Please step in.
Dear candidate, thank you very much for your thesis and even more so for your nice presentation, which actually clarified some things for me. My basic question is around expectancies, motives, drinking, and I would add actually experience with alcohol. And you're talking about a straight line from expectancies to motives to drinking, but doesn't drinking, to become a drinker, interfere between alcohol expectancies and motives, and in which way? I mean, are alcohol expectancy basically important for initiating drinking only, and when you're a drinker, then you have motives? Or does the experience with alcohol change actually the impact of expectancies and motives? So you usually, in your thesis, you use alcohol expectancies as outcome measure, but never as exposure measure. So how do, I mean, you may not have an answer from your thesis, but what do you think? How do expectancies actually shape motives? Do they stay the same? I mean, you use the motives questionnaire and change the wording to become expectancies, but do these children, in your opinion, keep the same motives as they had their expectancies, or are they influenced by the experience of their drinking? And then if so, what remains from expectancies as a predictor for drinking?
Honored sir, thank you very much for your question and for your compliments as well. So what this question is aiming at, in my view, is the reciprocal association of expectancies in drinking and drinking motives in drinking. Am I correct?
Well, let it put simply, are expectancies only for the non-drinker, and if they start drinking, then motives become the important variable? And if so, is there a link between expectancies shaped by experiences with drinking to motives, or just stay the motives the same as the expectancies were?
Right. All right. So first off, I've also conducted the systematic review in alcohol expectancies, and I found that expectancies also change at the moment that that drinking commences, and also when it progresses. That's at least one of the findings from this systematic review. And I know that many of the studies that are conducted with drinking motives focus on the theoretical sequence from expectancies to drinking motives to drinking, because that's the theoretical sequence in which they appear. And then what I would expect is both a change in motives, because when you start drinking, you might, for example, drink because your peers, your best friends are drinking when you're 14 or 15 years old, early drinking. You might see that the drinking actually have certain effects on you as an individual, the chemical effects, the psycho something effects. You get drunk, you get drunk, and that drunkenness might also shape, next to the motives for next time drinking, it might also shape your expectancies. And that's also what I found in the systematic review. So I do not expect that it's only motives that are responsible for drinking after it has initiated, when the individual has initiated. Then also we have used expectancies as an outcome. Indeed, we have not really focused on the association between expectancies and drinking. But in one study we did include the alcohol use as covariate, and there we found, for example, that exposure was still associated with expectancies. But yeah, it would be interesting to see if there is a pathway from exposure to expectancies and to drinking motives and to drinking, and whether that would change over time.
Thank you.
Does this answer your question?
Yeah, it is my question. So if you had more money and a larger sample size, you would probably try to look also into the link from expectancies to motives or from expectancies to drinking. And
Yes.
how strong would the effect be? I think, what do you think how strong the effects are? Because in your thesis, you did not give any effect sizes, and I thought that most of the effects are pretty small and partly varying between boys and girls, even though perhaps not significantly so. How strong do you think is actually the impact of expectancies to later continue drinking or heavy drinking?
I would say that in a theoretical sense that the effects of expectancies are smaller than the effects from drinking motives, but that's just highly speculative. I have not included that in my research.
Okay.
But I would say that the drinking motives are more proximal, and therefore they have a stronger effect in that sense.
Okay, thank you. I think I stop here.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Then I can now give the floor to Professor Knibbe from Maastricht University. Please.
Thank you. Nice to see you for the first time for me, Koen.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
I want to join my predecessors in praising your thesis. I also found it that you used very clear concepts and theories and did a very solid and innovative study with this all. Actually, it's one of the more academic theses I've read in the last year, and I mean it as a compliment. In a way, it was also hard to find relevant questions because of the quality of your, but still, I found one, and it also concerns a series of questions. It also concerns chapter 7. First, I would like you to elucidate a very particular sentence. You say in the discussion that, and here is a cite, in accordance, social motives are associated with current alcohol use, but not with binge drinking. That's the outcome of your study. And then you continue, this is in line with two previous studies among older adolescents and young adults, indicated that social motives predicted more frequent heavy drinking. So how can a cross-cultural, cross-sectional relation between social motives and not binge drinking, but let's say daily drinking, be in line with studies which show that there is a longitudinal relation between social motives? Is it a miswriting? You can keep the answer simple, but...
Yeah, in this sense, I've reasoned from the idea that that social motives are mostly associated with moderate, not heavy drinking, which. Sorry.
But you do say that previous studies show that social motives predicted more frequent and heavy drinking. Right. So what is it? Is social motives moderate drinking, or is it predictive for?
Then it might have been indeed a miswriting. That's true. It's mostly so that that the drinking, that social motives are associated with frequent, but not heavy drinking.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Then.
Because then coping and enhancement motives are the ones that are associated with the heavy drinking.
Yeah. Okay. I'll continue hopefully with more interesting questions. On that same page, but lower, you say social motives were not associated with current alcohol use 6 months later. And you offer for that the explanation that since about 2000, the number of occasions where young people could drink has sharply diminished. And you conclude, and that's again a citation, thus the young adolescents that do start drinking for social motives do not continue to do so. Rather, internal motives, enhancement and coping, may be associated with more frequent and binge drinking. I do not understand there the first part, more specifically that you say that they do not continue to drink for social motives. If I look at your table 1 in that chapter, it indicates that among adolescents who continue to drink have at the second measurement a marginally higher score on social motives than at first measurement. So there is no sign of discontinuation of the relevance of social motives for drinking. And also, I cannot find in table 1 any indication that enhancement and coping motives were increasing between the two time points, as you seem to suggest. So, do I understand your outcomes wrong, or do you have there perhaps not the right conclusion? What's the point here?
All right, thanks for your question. So, indeed, if you look at the raw scores of the drinking motives, they will stay, or they will change slightly. But I suggest to look at table 3, in which you can see that coping, or no, not coping, that social is not associated with current alcohol use or the frequency of alcohol use at the second time point. Because indeed, in general, the scores change in a different fashion, but when we associate social motives at the first time point with drinking at the second, we did not find an association.
Yes, I do see that. But then perhaps it's about the formulation then, that the formulation which you choose that adolescents discontinue drinking for social motives is not a very well, it's not really in accordance to how I see the data, including table 2 by the way, because yes, it's not significant, but it means only it's not predictive, but the relevance of social motives for drinking is about the same.
Yes, I agree to that. So the relevance of the social motives at the second time point are still considerable, but it's not associated with the current drinking at that second time point.
May I have a
Can you
last
keep
point
it for the next round?
Pardon?
Is it a short one?
It's a short one.
Okay.
All right.
You introduced the historical change in adolescent drinking since about 2000 as there are for your adolescents in your study less social occasions for drinking, and I think you're right there. But I keep wondering why, in case of less availability of drinking situations, you explain that as the reason why social motives have diminished predictive power for drinking. Because, as I understand the measurement of motives, it's not so dependent on the number of occasions in the time periods. It's just how important is drinking. So, why should the reduction in number of drinking opportunities of adolescents lead to a decrease in social motives?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think in that sense I can be quite short, as I think that if the social if the norm changes from more frequent drinking to less frequent drinking about in the same age group, what we also see from systematic reviews, for example, is that social norms are also changing around drinking. So the norm starts to change, and also what I also would suggest, it's also a speculative explanation there, is that this social aspect of drinking is becoming less strong, which is speculative, but it's one of the explanations that I put in the chapter indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I don't agree completely, but I think there should be other persons having a chance to question you. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very interesting topic, maybe for afterwards, because now the floor goes to Dr. Monshauer from the Trimbos Institute.
Dear candidates, dear Koen, first of all, my congratulations with your impressive thesis. It contains 6 articles with you as a first author, and 5 are already published. So that's a great achievement, and you can be proud of that. I think the thesis makes an important contribution to science, but you also have a message for organizations that are involved in alcohol prevention, such as the Trimbos Institute, where I work. And your advice is to make it clear to parents that they should drink as little as possible in front of their children. You suggest including this in national campaigns, such as Niks 18, no alcohol use before the age of 18. Now my question, your advice to drink as little as possible in the presence of your child is not an easy message, because a glass of wine with dinner or a beer after work is no longer possible for parents, or is discouraged. But if I look at chapter 6, table 1, it also concerns moderate drinkers, on average 3 glasses a week for the fathers and 1.2 for the mothers. And parents may wonder why this is also being taken away from them. And I was asking myself, does this mean that we should also advise parents not to drink alcohol-free beer and wine in the presence of their children, because that looks the same? And I wonder if your advice to us is the most effective approach. The results of chapter 6, alcohol exposure and preteen alcohol use, don't convince me enough of this, because I think that it's likely that parents who drink are also more likely to let their child take a sip, or that parents who drink set less strict rules. And if so, shouldn't the message stay as it is? Because I couldn't find that you controlled for these variables in your analysis. So maybe if you did, then the effect of exposure would disappear. So shouldn't the message not stay as it is? Don't give your child alcohol before the age of 18 and set strict rules, even if you as a parent drink yourself. Well, do you agree with me? And don't you think that we also need more research on that before we take over your advice? So I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Thank you for your compliments and for your question as well, Honored Madam. My first intuition would be not to agree with you. I'm sorry. The thing is that in this sense, we know from the literature that rules are very important. Sipping is in this sense also very important, because this may set the scene for more curiosity for the children, and it's also been shown in systematic reviews to be associated with heavier drinking when they get older. However, if we were to follow only rules and no sipping, parents may undermine by their exposure these rules. Because if your parents say you shouldn't drink, but they still drink when you are around, it's on average it may be low numbers. However, if we are to change alcohol use in the same way as we want to change smoking, which is in the Netherlands something that we are going to try to totally eradicate, I think. As I remember, if I can remember correctly, then even exposure of a couple of glasses per week should not occur, because that makes children more curious, and it still adds to the social norm that drinking is normative. And parents can say that they shouldn't do it. They should give strict rules, but it's again, in my eyes, undermining the rules that parents are giving. However, this is also speculative because I haven't included that in my research, and I would also be interested to see in what kind of effects this kind of interaction, if you will, would give.
Because it could also backfire. It could also have a negative effect. That parents say, well, if I even can take that glass of wine at dinner, then, well, forget about it. Now they exaggerate it. So I think you should be careful. And smoking is a little bit different, I think, because that's really harmful. Everyone knows, also for children, also for adults. But with alcohol, it's a bit less clear, and alcohol is well, it's so part of the society and of the life of a lot of people. So maybe the step is too big, and I would like also to see the real effects of exposure when you control for these other measures, like don't give your children alcohol. Because still a lot of parents do that. We see from research that most children get the alcohol from their parents. So maybe it's better to stress that more clearly to the parents than to interfere with their own drinking behavior. Or you should be careful, I think, in your message. But you think differently about that.
Yeah, I would say that those are very, very good arguments what you give here. However, what we also know from the literature is that alcohol use, even though it's not as how did you say that, as unhealthy as smoking, we still know that even after one glass per day. After one glass per day, the effect on the negative health effects on the body start to increase. Mm-hmm. So if we want to make it less normative, we should make, in my view, clear rules, because that's the only thing that people understand, in my view.
And that should also include alcohol-free beer and wine, because that looks the same. And children can make the difference, can see the difference?
That's a good question. So the rules as they are right now is that alcohol-free beer and wine are not focusing on the young population, as it is still unknown whether alcohol-free beer and wine has an impact on their later drinking. But now I'm talking about consumption, right? So if it concerns drinking alcohol-free beer and wine, I'm not really sure what we should say to the parents. I would in this case be more lenient regarding drinking a glass of alcohol-free beer. But I would make sure that the children still do not get any hold of it in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much for your exchange. Then the floor goes to Professor Wiers from the University of Amsterdam.
Dear candidate, also briefly start with congratulating you and the team for an impressive thesis. I think you and the team really put exposure as an important variable on the agenda. And I do agree with Professor Gomel that the interaction with own drinking experience would really benefit from further research. I have little time and many questions, so let's start with the first, and that is the very beginning. Already Professor Scholte grilled you on the cover of your thesis. I would like to grill you on your title. I would say that your title is misleading because it basically suggests that there is a single developmental pathway to alcohol use because it has the capital "the," and that's wrong, as we know for a long time. You start with the motivational model by Miles Cox. In fact, he already wrote a paper in the 1980s also, why there is no alcohol personality, and the reason is that there's really different subgroups. So the least you should do is differentiate between a more internalizing, depression, anxiety-prone route and a more sensation-seeking and impulsivity route. You already mentioned the SERPs, it's also in the Cooper model, and actually also in your own data, because as you see, the coping motives are infrequent, so it's only a subgroup, but they are related to binge drinking. So, first question, do you agree that your title is misleading and that there is no single pathway to alcohol use?
Honored sir, thank you for your compliments and for your question. I agree on the second part. So I agree that there is not one pathway. I don't agree on that the title is misleading. Because it's, in this sense, I think the thesis has been focusing on several, the developmental pathway focuses on several aspects of the development, because we, for example, we have a study of children between 4 and 6 and we follow them for 2 years, and we have a study of adolescents between 10 and 13 and follow them for 3 years. So in that sense, we try to capture a part of the developmental pathway to alcohol use. I do agree that it's not one pathway, but yeah, I don't know if one developmental pathway to alcohol use would sound.
I think we agreed to disagree here, but let's move on to the next question. Role of alcohol problems in the parents. If I'm correct, you didn't really assess this. And actually, my own thesis in the 1990s was on children of alcoholics. And the interesting observation was that in young children, you actually see more negative expectancies, are even more negative than other children. Whereas in adolescence, you see more, excitement and positive expectancies, which appear to be mediated by the fact that they start drinking when genetic factors kick in. So I'm missing something on potential alcohol use problems by the parent. And if it's correct that you didn't measure it, of course you could use a proxy by, say, looking if the parents with the highest alcohol use, say the top 10% or so, if those children have more negative expectancies. Did you look at that?
Yes. That's a good question. I haven't looked at it. It would be interesting for future research. I do know that recently a study came out from Waddell, I don't know how you pronounce it, but in this study it shows that children of maternal alcoholics, so alcoholism or alcoholic mothers, had less negative expectancies, which is counterintuitive. But if you look at the association between parental alcoholism and expectancies among kids and adolescents, you see still some mixed evidence in that.
What age were they? Because if they were older, then it would actually fit a lot of other literature as well.
Oof, I do not dare to say. I think they were they were adolescents. I don't know if they were younger or older adolescents.
Okay, then I have a final little question, and that's about your second slide, which is also the graph on page 11. And it's about the development of alcohol use over time. Actually, I was one of the people who was in the parliamentary committee advising to raise the age to 18 to the dissatisfaction of my son, who became, who was just 16 when it finally came up, the rule. But anyway, I think we all agreed that this was a good idea. But now, if I look at this graph, what you basically see is a steady decline of alcohol use until the moment the 18-year-old rule comes in, and then it stabilizes. So, on second thoughts, was this such a great idea?
Thank you for this question. It's an interesting question. I think I have witnessed the presentation. I don't know. It might even have been on the night when you were presenting as well, where we have been talking about that the prevention measures come into effect around 1 year, up to 1 year after they have been set. So there might still have been a good result.
Hora est.
So the defense is hereby concluded abruptly. I give the floor once again to the candidates.
Having defended my doctoral thesis to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector, my supervisors and co-supervisor.
Thank you. Now we adjourn this session and we ask you to leave the Zoom meeting.
All right. Am I allowed? Okay.
Suspense, suspense.
It's such a pity. My God.
Yeah, it's really too bad. But we will have a party at some point someday. And also, it's just nice to see everybody again. Also, Gerhard. How is everything in Switzerland?
Well, it's fine. We just came back yesterday from a week holidays, but traveling through Switzerland. So the Italian-speaking parts haven't been there too. It was pretty nice. We had a wonderful own houses up of the Lago Maggiore and had our barbecue parties in the evening, looking over the sea, over the lake. It was brilliant.
Sounds perfect.
Just came back for you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, back to being a formal meeting. On behalf of the Council of Deans of Radboud University Nijmegen, we have decided to award you, Koen Smit, the title of Doctor. I invite Professor Kunche to fulfill the task assigned to him.
In the name of Lord, with the power entrusted by law to the Council of Deans, I hereby confer upon you, Koen Smith, born in Rieden, the title of Doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society.
Okay, could you see it?
Now here it is, Koen.
Beautiful.
Congratulations.
Wow.
Yeah. The supervisor, Professor Kunche, will now address Dr. Smit in his laudatio. Please be seated.
Dear Koen, now that's it. You have made it and you are now Dr. Smit. Congratulations. We have come a long way together. 7 years ago, you have been writing your master thesis and your supervisors at that time, Rutger and Martin, knocked on my door because your topic was similar to the PhD thesis I defended at the University of Maastricht more than a decade ago. And I'm very happy that my two of my three supervisors are present today here. There was an opportunity for you to do an internship, and I was very happy for you to come to my former workplace in Switzerland. During that stay, I tried to show you aspects of statistical modeling and drinking motors during the week and snowboarding on the weekends. Well, I have to say that for the one, you have been more gifted than for the other. That means estimating slopes in complex models had been more your thing than riding slopes down in the snow. However, we both had much fun, at least for me that was the case. What started actually as a collaboration on your master thesis almost naturally evolved into a PhD project in October 2014, when I was awarded a WIDI project from the Dutch National Science Foundation, NWO. The topics of parents exposing their children to alcohol use, that has been on my mind for quite some time, quickly became our project. From these early days on, I have been delighted to see what a fantastic team player and organizer you are, and I'm very grateful to you, but also to your other PhD supervisors and numerous people, both at the Trimbos Institute, from where most of the fieldwork was organized, and the Behavioral Science Institute of Radboud University. This has been so important because I could not be with you on a daily basis. While having done research and teaching in the Netherlands for more than a decade, I have always lived abroad to be close to my family and to my main workplace. And that was first in Switzerland, and now it's here in Australia. Despite these unusual and sometimes cumbersome circumstances, I'm well aware of that. The WIDI project, complex as it has been, was and still is hugely successful. And this was only possible due to your high dedication, of course, Carmen's high dedication, and also all your other supervisors and colleagues, for which I'm very thankful. Moreover, beyond your dedication, I highly value your energy and perseverance that's absolutely needed for completion of a PhD thesis, I have to say. I remember us driving hours and hours through Belgium, Germany, France, or Spain on the way to our various working retreats. You, with your notebook on your knees, discussing, estimating, or writing down results from complex research questions or statistical models. We have gone through the same topics over and over again, just to make sure that what we report is substantial and robust enough to warrant publication. And also the publication process has required a lot of your energy and perseverance to work on and submit manuscripts and their revised version again and again and again. The fruit of this dedication, perseverance, and hard work you have brilliantly defended today. And I'm proud to have sparked interest in you for the topics of young people's alcohol expectancies and exposure. Looking at the beautiful illustrations of your book reminds me of the great time we had in the Alps together, and that you introduced me to mead, the kind of honey beer that you made for me, and the Dutch folk metal music that I still listen to. Thank you, Koen, for having been such a responsive student, but particularly for being such a good friend throughout the years. I hope our joint enterprise has been as much fun for you as it has been for me. Now the deed is done, and I wish you all the best for the next adventure that's waiting for you. I know we are living in strange times, and in which not even I am allowed to see you for weeks now, despite the fact that I kind of live next door. I hope that you can still celebrate and find a way to connect and celebrate this big achievement with your friends and loved ones. Cheers, Koen.
Yes, thank you very much.
I would also like to congratulate Dr. Smith on your achievement in faraway Australia. It's just as happy as you would be here, I hope. And I'd like to thank everybody here who has been taking part in this odd situation today, in this odd ceremony. Still, it is well achieved by you. I'd like to congratulate you and all your friends and family, wherever they are, on behalf of the College of Deans with your acquired title. So we have now come to the conclusion of the ceremony, and I'd like to end it with a prayer. Gratias tibi agimus omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnat per omnia saecula saeculorum. Thank you. Now we stay here.
Ja, u kunt op het podium, dan kan hij u zien.
Okay, so this ends the official part, so now we'll just chat and mingle.
Gefeliciteerd.
Gefeliciteerd. I also would like to say something, if possible. I wrote you a poem. It's in Dutch, though, but I think it's nice for your family also. Zo, hooggeleerde Dr. Smit, lieve Koen. Adem in, adem uit. Het uur van de verdediging is eindelijk voorbij. Gevoelsmatig voelde het als een immens karwei. De finish van jouw 5-jarig promotietraject is hierbij bereikt. Maar je bul wordt in je handen pas later uitgereikt. Daar zit je dan, ruim 16.000 kilometer van ons vandaan. Achter een laptop en mag ik aandacht schenken aan. Nee, niet aan het veelbesproken corona, maar aan Dr. Smit in eigen persona. Want vandaag is de dag dat het mag. Zit achterover en hoor het aan. Je kunt alles nu even laten gaan. Adem in, adem uit. De oogst van jouw PhD staat klaar en al was het soms zwaar, het is waar. Geen mailtjes meer naar respondenten of aandachtig luisteren naar studenten. Niet meer eindeloos typen en publiceren of het artikel opnieuw indienen en corrigeren. Nu geen presentatie op een congres of een ingewikkeld denkproces. Het is tijd dat jij de oogst gaat binnenhalen en kan genieten van alle zonnestralen. Hoewel, in hoeverre is dit nu waar? Jouw PhD-project is immers omgevormd in een postdocbaan. Je hebt besloten je onderzoeksactiviteiten voor te zetten door ook dit jaar volop schrijfwerk te verzetten. Maar laten we beginnen bij de start van jouw carrière. Na het succesvol afronden van 3 studies vormde dit voor jou geen enkele barrière. Adem in, adem uit. Jouw studiegenoten van de Research Master, alles smachtend naar een PhD-plek, om dagenlang te zitten achter de computer, dat is toch knettergek? Toch heeft zo'n baan ook zijn voordelen. De vele reisjes naar het buitenland, dat is zeker aan te bevelen. De stage van jouw master leidde naar professor Emanuel, of leidde naar Lausanne in Zwitserland. Her en der wat netwerken, dat bleek zeer relevant. Je maakte indruk op professor Emanuel en hoefde niet meer te strijden voor een AIO-positie, dat ging snel. Van een strenge sollicitatieprocedure was geen sprake, want Emanuel kwam meteen ter zake. Ik wil Koen hebben als AIO op mijn toegekende VIDI-project. Jouw handtekening werd snel op het contract gezet. Adem in, adem uit. En zo begon jouw AJO-avontuur. Leidt zien drinken tot doen drinken in deze Nederlandse alcoholcultuur. De werkzaamheden bleken een conjunctuur. Toppen afgewisseld met dalen, zo kenmerkend als het zich presenteert in een figuur. Terugkijkend op wat je allemaal hebt gedaan, diverse momenten hebben mij versteld doorstaan. Neem nou onze congrestrips naar Duitsland, Zweden en Thailand. Vele nachten doorgebracht in goedkope Airbnb's. Dat schept een band. Jouw interesse in alcohol bracht je daar regelmatig persoonlijk in praktijk. Liters drinkend in de Duitse biergarten. Volgens het Nederlands drinkadvies is dit veel te omvangrijk. Dan maar happy drinks promoten op Pinkpop. Alcoholvrije dranken zijn voor veel drinkers immers stop. Na vele presentaties op congressen gegeven te hebben, werd het tijd om zelf een congres van wereldformaat neer te zetten. In Utrecht vond het fameuze Kettle Brewing Society congres plaats. De output van jouw vele werkzaamheden waren het tegenovergestelde van ondermaats. Adem in, adem uit. Naast het harde werken tijdens je promotietraject volgde je ook een yogaopleiding voor een rustgevend effect. De hardloopschoenen werden ook vaak aangetrokken. Je hebt in Nijmegen en omgeving heel wat heuvels doorgetrokken. Je hebt een fantastische weg belopen. Mijn gedicht is nu bijna tot een eind gekomen. Want zo is het leven. Alles komt en alles gaat. En het is de kunst om stil te staan. Daar hecht ik persoonlijk waarde aan. Een prachtige toekomst staat op je te wachten. Wat zal het allemaal brengen? Er ontstaan ontelbare gedachten. Wees dankbaar voor datgene wat op je pad zal komen. Alle wegen leiden naar je dromen. Ik heb gezegd.
Beautiful. Thank you, Carmen. And everybody as well.
We have to leave you because there's a next promotion here, so we leave this room. Thank you for being there
Geniet ervan.
on screen.
Manuel, Gerard.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers, see you later.
At least we can have a drink now, good. It's late enough, right?
It's time.
Time for some expectancies and exposure.
Yes, they can still see us, eh? Bye-bye.
All right.